Good morning. We are live and we are going to be talking about the prosperity gospel this morning. How did evangelicals fall for such an obvious con, for such an obvious heresy? How did evangelicals fall for the prosperity gospel? So that's the topic of this morning's live stream. So when you look at the most famous pastors of this generation, you know who they are. Joel Osteen, Joyce Meyer, Benny Hinn, T.D. Jakes, go up and down the line. When you look at the most famous pastors, even of yesteryear, people like Oral Roberts, when you look at the so-called Christian television networks, TBN, Daystar, they all have one thing in common, and that is they all preach the prosperity gospel. So here's what I wrote in the live stream description. So we're going to talk about this, and then I want to see what you have to say. Why do you think evangelicals fell for this? There's a lot of reasons. I mean, obviously, sometime in the middle of the 20th century, evangelicals started to adopt the, judge not mentality. That's not the way it was 80 years ago, 100 years ago, 150 years ago. If you read Christian writings, people didn't think that way, but today it's judge not. It's the 11th commandment. Thou shalt be polite all the time. Never name names. Be polite. Obviously, a lot of evangelicals are biblically illiterate. That's huge. But I think it really comes down to one or two things. But we'll get into that, and I want to know what you have to think, what you have to say a little later. But here's what I wrote in the live stream description. I said, if you've heard of the name it and claim it movement, then you're familiar, or if you just heard that expression, name it and claim it, then you're familiar with the prosperity gospel as promoted by heretical television networks like TBN, Daystar, Inspiration Network, The Word, there's a long list of them. I said, this is also known as the Word Faith movement or Word of Faith. That is a subset of the larger Charismatic Pentecostal movement. So some of the most famous pastors in the world are Word of Faith. And these are false teachers who are running an obvious con on the body of Christ. They are getting rich, and they tell you, if you just do what we say, if you just believe hard enough and give us your money, then God will. Sometimes they're so blatant. God, if you give us $100, God will pay you back 1,000. There's that clip of Creflo Dollar, who is this like? Is that his real name? But I guess it is. Aptly fitting, right? But Creflo Dollar at his church with some other guy, Leroy something, I don't know, and they're like dancing. There's cash just covering the platform, and they're dancing like woo-hoo, woo, woo, and dancing on top of $100 bills. And of course, all the people in the audience, they had to give the money for Creflo to be bragging, like rubbing it in their face, like, look at how rich we are, woohoo. And it's amazing that anyone buys into this stuff. But how did evangelicals... Number one, how did evangelicals fall for it? And number two, why aren't more fighting against it? Well, that's starting to change. But that's what I wrote in the description. So before I give you the answer of why evangelicals fell for this obvious grift, let me just define the terms. So for the three people out there who don't know what the prosperity gospel is, let me give you this definition. The prosperity gospel, also known as Word of Faith, or health and wealth, name it and claim it, is a teaching within some Christian circles that claims that God's will is, this is God's will, that every believer be healthy and wealthy, that every believer experience financial prosperity, physical health, and material success, and that these blessings can be obtained through faith, positive confession, that's the word of faith, you need to speak it out loud, name it and claim it, and generous giving. You have to sow seed, you have to give money to a particular ministry. So if you do all of these things, these teachers say that it is the right of God's children, you, to never see suffering, sickness, in poverty. It is your right as a child of God to experience health and wealth. Okay, the prosperity gospel. And then they go further and they say, if you do suffer or get sick, or if you don't have a lot of money, that is a sign that you have weak faith, or you are not giving enough money to the anointed teachers. So that's the way this system works. So if you've ever seen faith healers on television, I mean, that's prosperity gospel. It's all part of it. So, or if you've seen televangelists, this is the key term, sowing a seed, right? Sow your seed of faith, AKA give money. That's prosperity gospel. So the idea is if you just believe hard enough, if you just believe hard enough and give your money to the anointed teacher on television, or maybe locally, there's a lot of local churches that try to run the same scam. But if you just give money to the anointed teacher, then God will bless you with health and wealth. Okay, obviously this is not true. Obviously the only people getting rich, as John MacArthur once said, the only people getting rich off of this are the ones sitting at the top of the Ponzi scheme, like Osteen and Myers and Hinn and the rest of them. So they will say that God will give you whatever you ask for. They take Psalm 37 out of context, right? That God will give you the desires of your heart. It doesn't mean that God's going to give you whatever you want. It's that God puts the desires in your heart. God puts godly desires. So they twist Scripture. They use 3 John chapter, well, only one chapter, 3 John verse 2, where John says, he's writing to someone and he says, I hope you're prospering and that you're in good health. It's just a simple greeting like, hey, I hope you're doing well, hope things are going good. But they take verses out of context to build this false doctrine. And it is a false doctrine. So they'll say things like, if you can just have faith for it, and then you identify what you want, that is, you name it, and you have faith for it, then you can name it and claim it. So if you want a new Ferrari, you can have a new Ferrari. If you want a new private jet, you can get a private jet. And I think the reason why people buy into this is because people like Creflo Dollar and Jesse Duplantis and Kenneth Copeland, they actually do have private jets. So people look at them and they say, well, it's working for them. That's proof that it worked. No, they're the con artists. And by the way, there's thousands of failed prosperity preachers who don't have any money, but we don't know their names because it didn't work out for them. So for every one guy like Kenneth Copeland, where this actually, they actually con people out of enough money to get a private jet, there's probably 10,000 failed pastors who are not able to pull the wool over people's eyes. So, but I think people look at Joel Osteen and he's filthy rich and they think, well, it worked for him. Maybe it'll work for me. But I think a lot of people, they know better, but this is really a theology for desperate people. It's a theology for desperate people who they know better, but I got nothing to lose. I got $20 left. I'll send it in to Joyce Meyer. There's an interview where Joyce Meyer is being interviewed by NBC News, and the anchor is like, Joyce, aren't you worried that people who can't pay their bills are just going to, like, on a hope and a prayer, send it to you? And Joyce is like, no, I don't worry about that. It's like, yeah, I bet she doesn't. They don't care about you. They're fleecing the flock, and it's so obvious, and yet it seems to be working for them. As Joel Osteen always says, if you just have the faith for it, you'll get that promotion at work. You'll get that raise. After all, you're a champion. You're a victor. You were meant to win. I mean, these are the types of things that Joel Osteen, honestly, every sermon I've ever heard Joel Osteen preach, he always mentions getting that promotion at work, getting a raise. All the time. He's always mentioning money because that's what it's all about for these people. Of course, when it doesn't work, right? When you sow your seed of faith, and who is the guy, P.T. Barnum, who said there's a sucker born every minute? Whoever said that. I mean, that's true. So it's a theology for desperate people. And yeah, I'm not saying this to be unkind, but it's a theology for suckers. I hate to admit it, but before I wasn't a Christian at the time. I was I was a false convert around the year 2000, I'd forget, 2001 to 2003, maybe at the latest. I was at a low point. Things were not going well at all. And I got something in the mail saying, hey, if you send $50 to get your anointed prayer robe, I think I actually sent someone $50. Of course, that was, again, I didn't have any discernment because I didn't have the Holy Spirit. But I was desperate, and this thing comes in the mail, and you kind of, I knew it wouldn't work, but I figured, well, hey, on the off chance, it's like playing the lottery. Like, you know you're not going to win, but you think, well, someone's got to win. So, but that was a long time ago. But a lot of people have bought into this. And I know that many people watching this live stream right now in the comment section, I've heard it from people. They say, 5 years ago, I was listening to Joel Osteen. 10 years ago, I was, neck deep in TBN doctrine. Like, people have, woken up and come out of this. But for a lot of people, they just don't know any better. And we'll get to the reason why people were deceived. But yeah, when it doesn't work out, when people don't get the money, when they don't have health, when people get sick and even die, well, whose fault is that? Well, it's your fault because you didn't give enough money or you didn't have enough faith. And again, there's an interview where Joyce Meyer actually admits that. She admits, yeah, we told people if your child died, that's because you didn't have enough faith. Like, she just admits this, like, clear conscience, doesn't bother her at all that they spiritually abuse people in the worst possible ways. So whose fault is it? Of course, it's your fault. So when it doesn't work, which it hardly ever does, it doesn't work. But like I said, a few people, sometimes people succeed. Sometimes people do get rich off of this. But it's the prosperity preachers themselves getting rich, not you. That's the point. Okay, so health, wealth, success, private jets, piles of money. You can understand why this is so alluring. This is what every person or what every unbeliever wants. And they always have a verse to take out of context. Never mind that Jesus says, remember what Jesus said? That he had no place to lay his head. Peter said, silver and gold, we have none. Like the apostles, this didn't work for Jesus and the apostles. So does Joyce Meyer and Joel Osteen have more faith than Christ and the apostles? Because Jesus didn't get rich. Again, he had no place to lay his head. Paul had his thorn in the flesh. Timothy had stomach problems. They weren't rich. They were persecuted. They were suffering. I mean, this is one of the most common themes straight throughout the New Testament. Suffering. So the prosperity gospel obviously didn't work for Christ and the apostles. Why? Because the whole thing's a sham. The whole thing is a creation that developed really in the late 1800s. Middle of the 20th century is when it started catching on. So let's give a brief history of the movement, and then I'll tell you why I believe it was embraced within evangelical Christianity, or at the very least, tolerated. Like, many of you attend churches where your pastor doesn't preach the prosperity gospel, but he tolerates it. Like, he's not willing to call Joel Osteen a false teacher. So it's toleration. And you know how this goes with the whole LGB thing. It starts with toleration, then acceptance, then promotion, and then you start persecuting everyone who disagrees. So it always works in those stages. So let's do a brief history. In the late 1800s, there was a movement called New Thought. New Thought. The man known for this was named Phineas Quimby. And by the way, this is where the cult of Christian Science came from. They referred to this idea as the mind sciences. Of course, it wasn't scientific, but they called it the mind sciences, that physical healing was possible for anybody. So it was kind of a mind over matter type of a thing. Right around that time, you saw the rise of the Pentecostal movement in the early 20th century. And eventually, these things got blended together, primarily by a man named E.W. Kenyon. Then, a man named Kenneth Hagin, who really did systematize this, for a lack of a better term. Kenneth Hagin started reading Kenyon in his writings. And Kenneth Hagin is considered sort of the godfather of the word faith movement. So then, long story short, in the middle of the 20th century, you saw the rise of what? New Age, right? In the 1960s, the age of Aquarius, New Age. And right around that time, you also saw the rise of the Charismatic movement. So these things were all happening at the same time. It's only a matter of time before some grifter decides, hey, I'm going to blend this all together and create my own thing. And that's exactly what happened. Now, let me be clear. I want to be fair to our charismatic friends. Not all charismatics and not all Pentecostals are word faith. Okay, not all charismatics believe in the prosperity gospel. But everyone who does believe in the prosperity gospel, everyone who is part of the word faith movement is Pentecostal and charismatic. So these heretical teachings of New Thought and later New Age, they got blended with this fringe Christian teaching, if you can call it that. So New Age, New Thought got blended together with Pentecostalism and the charismatic movement. And because pretty much anything goes in those movements, again, I know there's exceptions, but within the charismatic movement, there's not a lot of rules, right? In a Baptist church, like a really conservative Baptist church, there's probably rules, right? Like you need to, some churches are more strict. The charismatic movement was the least, and still is the least strict of all Christian sects. So not a lot of rules, pretty much anything goes or anything is tolerated. I mean, that's just the way it is. And you can see that just by the things that have been taught on TBN. Like you would never allow that in your Baptist church to be taught, but at TBN, pretty much anything goes. Like Benny Hinn teaching there's 9 members of the Trinity. That wouldn't fly in your average church, but on TBN, hey, they're willing to let those things slide. So around the middle of the 20th century, 1950s, 1960s, Oral Roberts was already on television, and Oral Roberts was considered the first prosperity preacher, okay, on television. So Oral Roberts was on TV, and I did a podcast on this. Oral Roberts was very good friends with, guess who? You saw him in the thumbnail. That's right. Oral Roberts was good friends with Billy Graham. So around this time, fast forward to the 1970s, Billy Graham had already been dubbed as America's pastor. Billy was world famous, and Billy Graham openly endorsed Oral Roberts. So remember, Oral Roberts is he's considered the first prosperity preacher. And Billy Graham affirmed him. And Billy would let Oral Roberts pray and speak at some of his crusades. So the camel's nose is already in the tent at this point. So when you look at that, once you realize Oral Roberts was the first preacher, I mean, were guys doing it before him? Probably, but he's known as the first, big name preaching the prosperity gospel. When Billy Graham affirmed Oral Roberts, that was step number 1 in making the prosperity gospel tolerable. And then later it went mainstream. But still, you got to remember at this point, the charismatic movement in the 1970s, it was just getting started. It was not accepted. It was seen as a fringe movement. Pentecostalism was on the fringe. Like Baptists may or may not consider them Christians. I remember growing up in my church, I was taught when I was a kid that Pentecostals believe in works salvation. They believe you can lose your salvation. That's works. And if they were considered Christians, it was like barely. I'm just saying that was my impression of what I was taught as a child. So the point is, Pentecostals and Charismatics were not really accepted into the mainstream. They weren't accepted by Baptists and Bible churches and by Presbyterians, certainly. They were, again, at best on the fringe. But in the 1970s and 1980s, things started to change with the rise of Christian television. So it was the CCM music that started, kind of got them in the door. And also TBN, Trinity Broadcast Network. So you know this. TBN, back then, just like today, TBN platforms the worst of the worst when it comes to false teachers. I mean, TBN platformed Mike Murdoch. There is no man more slimy than him. Mike Murdoch, Benny Hinn, Kenneth Copeland. At the same time, and you're starting to see it, at the same time, guess who endorsed TBN? Guess who endorsed TBN and its founder, Paul and Jan Crouch? You know who affirmed them, Billy Graham. Okay, so because by the 1980s, Billy Graham was almost like a godlike figure. I remember growing up and people said things like, Billy Graham is the greatest Christian who ever lived, second only to the Apostle Paul. Like, that's the way people viewed Billy Graham, still do. He's like a godlike figure. So if Billy said it, that settled it. So the fact of the matter is, Billy Graham affirmed Paul Crouch, Jan Crouch, and TBN. I mean, Franklin Graham still is friendly with the Crouch family, at least he was up until recently. So the fact that Billy endorsed the first prosperity preacher, Oral Roberts, okay, that's step number one. Then Billy affirmed Paul Crouch and TBN, step number two. And but still, charismaticism was still not fully accepted by a lot of evangelicals and Baptists, and certainly not the fundamentalists. But because TBN aired Billy Graham crusades, guess what? A lot of Baptists would tune in to TBN to watch the Billy Graham crusades. So once evangelicals started watching TBN, it all started becoming normal. Maybe they would tune in to watch Charles Stanley or Billy Graham, who seemed like the good guys. But right after Billy Graham was on, guess who came on next? Benny Hinn. So it just started becoming normal. As evangelicals got exposed to Christian television, TBN, and later Daystar, the line started becoming a little blurry. So reason number one, to get down to it, why evangelicals accepted the prosperity gospel, or at least tolerated it, is because Billy Graham affirmed prosperity preachers. I really believe that is the number one reason, along with number two, this was all, plastered all over television. So the word faith charismatics, they dominated and still do the music industry, CCM music. Charismatics, almost all CCM artists, like 97% of them, they're all charismatic. So this word faith movement dominates Christian music. It dominates Christian television. All the networks, Christian television networks, are word faith. So it just became normal. That's the second thing. And then the third reason is the good guys, Billy Graham, also people like Charles Stanley or David Jeremiah and others, Ray Comfort, people who appeared on TBN and Daystar, they would not fight against it. So they were at least passive, and sometimes they endorsed the prosperity preachers. And again, Billy Graham did endorse them. So the line started getting really blurry, real quick. So just kind of fast forward, and I want to wrap up this segment to get to your comments and questions. But you can't deny that guys like Benny Hinn and Kenneth Copeland and Mike Murdoch and Paul Crouch, like, these men are false teachers. If they're not false teachers, it's like Justin Peters says, if Benny Hinn is not a false teacher, then that term has no meaning. So without question, the people on TBN are false teachers. So that generation of word, faith, prosperity, gospel heretics, number one, they went mainstream, or were accepted into the mainstream because Billy Graham affirmed them. Number two, they were on television. And then reason number three, which this might be more important for right now moving forward, the prosperity preachers were not marked and avoided. They were not called out by the good guys. Okay, so let's just wrap this up. Billy Graham being the grand poobah, he endorses Oral Roberts, Paul Crouch, TBN. Billy sent a signal, whether intentional or not. And if you did see that movie, Jesus Revolution, put out by Greg Laurie, remember that came out, 2 years ago? The film Jesus Revolution. There was a clip in that film of Billy Graham endorsing the Jesus People movement and thereby endorsing the Charismatic movement. So Billy endorsed all of this. Then, fast forward to right now, what's been happening the past 20 years, you have who are, Benny Hinn, bad guy. Kenneth Copeland, bad guy, right? Mike Murdoch, definitely snake oil salesman, right? These people scam the poor, the sick, and the elderly. I remember seeing Benny Hinn, one of his programs, he said, there's a widow out there, you're poor, you have nothing, you have $300 left in your account. Send that money into Benny Hinn Ministries. Show that you have faith and God will reward you. Like, you have to have a seared conscience to scam and lie to a poor elderly widow. I mean, Jesus talked about this, that the Pharisees were wicked because what? They devoured widows' houses. There's a long line of people who died poor and sick because they sent all their money to the TV preacher. I mean, it became sort of like a trope in the 1980s, 1990s, just like even the world could see that this is all a scam, and yet your average evangelical pastor wouldn't say peep about it. And that's still true. I mean, we had a evangelical pastors meeting, and I don't want to, go into too many details, but, I dropped out just because there was no will to confront false teaching. It's just people don't want to do it. And yet that is the job of a shepherd, to, yes, preach the gospel, but also to what? All scripture is profitable for what? Rebuke, reproof. We're told to what? Have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them. Ephesians 5:11. Every New Testament epistle except Philemon deals with the problem of false teachers. I mean, you can't preach through the New Testament and not see it. This is a major theme, and yet most pastors seem unwilling, totally unwilling to do it. So this is the problem. We'll end with this and then get into your questions and comments. But the bad guys were fairly obvious, but the good guys would not call them out. And sometimes the good guys would partner with them. So guys like Charles Stanley. Charles Stanley was good friends, apparently, with Benny Hinn. That's what has been reported. David Jeremiah went on set with Paul Crouch and encouraged people to support Paul Crouch and TBN. He also went on the Jim Bakker program. Even someone like Ray Comfort. Ray Comfort was on Daystar for 20 years. He went on Joyce Meyer's program. A guy like Jack Hibbs. Like, these are the good guys, right? Jack Hibbs. Jack Hibbs isn't prosperity gospel, and he's not. I don't think Jack Hibbs is a false teacher, but Jack Hibbs would go on Daystar. He went on Joni Lamb's program. Now, Joni Lamb is a prosperity preacher, a prosperity gospel prophetess, if you will, who claims divine revelation. Jack Hibbs went on her TV program and said how honored he was to be. So you see the point. People like that, the good guys, whether it's Hibbs, Charles Stanley affirmed Paul Crouch. He eulogized him after he died. All of these guys, the good guys, Ray Comfort, they were on TBN. They were on Daystar. They did fundraisers for TBN. See, they gave their stamp of approval to the Trinity Broadcast Network. So that sent a message. And Ray Comfort being on Daystar and going on Joyce Meyer's program, and Ray Comfort doing that podcast with Andrew Womack, who is a word faith false teacher. This sends a message that, okay, you guys, maybe Benny Hinn isn't your cup of tea, but he's not that bad. Okay, maybe Andrew Womack and the Daystar, the prosperity preach, maybe we don't agree with it, but we're willing to fellowship with these guys. We're willing to go on their programs. We're certainly not going to call it out. And see, that's the big problem. They were not willing to call it out. And I'll end with this. If Billy Graham, Charles Stanley, David Jeremiah, Ray Comfort, and Jack Hibbs, just those 5 men, if those 5 men all did what the Bible said and they called out false teachers by name, if those 5 men called TBN heretical, we don't want nothing to do with this, Oral Roberts is a false teacher, Benny Hinn is a false teacher, the Crouch family, the the people at Daystar, the Lambs, Marcus and Joni Lamb, if those 5 men just called out these people by name and said they're false teachers, mark and avoid them based on Romans 16, 17, if they did that, we would not be in the situation we're in today. I firmly, actually, if just Billy Graham did it, I don't think we would be in the position we are today. See, people are sheep. I mean, we're all sheep, right? Jesus is the good shepherd, but we follow the shepherd. But people are sheep. People follow along with what leaders say. And we're all following someone. And the question is, are you following Jesus and the Bible, or are you following along with the spirit of the age, the ecumenical movement, just kind of going along to get along? Well, okay, yes, this guy's popular. He has 1 million subscribers on YouTube, but he's endorsing heretics. But if I say something, then people are going to get upset. I won't get as many subscribers. I call this the popularity gospel. There's just an unwillingness to confront error because it's not popular. Okay, so that was the live stream for today. Thank you for tuning in. And remember, be part of a good local Bible-believing church. Support those ministries that do the work of discernment. The gospel is always paramount. Salvation by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. But now more than ever, we need to fight against the prosperity gospel and all the false teaching that is out there on television, on the internet. Not enough people are doing it. So when you see a ministry that is preaching sound doctrine and doing this work, I think it's really important to support those ministries. Okay, thanks for watching. And until next time, may the Lord be with you and have a great day.